The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maury Markowitz, and I am the president of the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual media launch of the Roadmap to a U.S. Hydrogen Economy and introduce the master of ceremonies for this event, Dr. Jack Brouwer. Jack is professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering and director of the National Fuel Cell Research Center and Advanced Power and Energy Program at the University of California, Irvine. Jack, it's all yours.
Thank you, Maury. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to note. I will begin this event with a review of the major findings of the Roadmap to a U.S. Hydrogen Economy report developed by McKinsey and Company. We will then hold an initial Q&A session with myself and our industry panel of speakers. Following the Q&A, we will have a series of industry presentations expanding on the role of private industry in achieving the goals of the roadmap. We will conclude with another Q&A session with all panelists again at that time. Should you have any questions throughout the event, please submit them in the questions box in GoToWebinar. With that, it is my pleasure to begin. Thank you. So U.S. companies from across many sectors have come together to develop this roadmap for a U.S. hydrogen economy. And many of these companies are household names, internationally recognized brands. And the benefits of hydrogen include economic growth and employment, resiliency and reliability in the increasingly renewable grid, reduction in local pollutants, and in greenhouse gases. And this roadmap has been set up so that there are 4 phases of introducing hydrogen into the economy. So the U.S. industry roadmap lays out a 10-year plan in 4 steps, 4 phases: immediate next steps, early scale-up, diversification, and broad rollout. And hydrogen has unique characteristics as a zero emissions vector. And that's why it can be very broadly used in all kinds of applications in our zero emissions sustainable future. In particular, we're highlighting in this graph 5 uses of hydrogen. First, for power generation and grid balancing, both in centralized and in distributed applications, hydrogen offers features that nothing else can with regard to zero emissions and long duration and massive storage capabilities. In addition, the slides are not advancing as fast as I'd like. It can be used as a transportation fuel. It's being widely used in materials handling and some light duty and heavy duty applications that are just beginning. And it can be used also for residential and commercial buildings, including blending it into the gas system and used for combined heat and power. It's a feedstock already today for industries like ammonia and methanol refineries, and can be used for long distance transport in aviation and marine transport as a zero emissions fuel. Finally, industry needs both high temperature heat and reducing gas functionality that hydrogen can offer with zero emissions. And the current hydrogen market is already pretty big in this country, 11.4 million metric tons, about a $17 billion value. It's mostly being made, 77%, from reforming, steam methane reforming of natural gas. Some of it is produced by the refining industry itself as a byproduct. And you can see that refining is the biggest market in 57% of the total market, and ammonia and methanol comprise the remaining large market for hydrogen today. And it is inevitable that we will make this hydrogen in the future from all zero emissions sources, primary energy sources. This is going to happen, and it's already transitioning to this today. And what this study has done is to be agnostic about the way in which we make hydrogen, as long as it is low carbon. And you can see here, we can make it by water electrolysis, we can make it by reforming of renewable fuels and carbon capture and storage. We can make it by gasification of wastes or as a byproduct for other industrial applications. And we already see throughout the United States locations where we have formations that can do the carbon capture and storage adjacent to hydrogen production facilities, hydrogen use facilities like ammonia plants. And you can see that these are concurrent already throughout the United States. And the roadmap lays out a plan for hydrogen to contribute more than 14% of total US energy demand. And it builds this up over time to the year 2050, where you see this large bar, okay, of hydrogen uses in society. And some of them are for the existing types of uses that you see on the very bottom here, but it's built up by also using it as a fuel for transportation. And secondly, for a fuel for residential and commercial buildings. And then as a new feedstock for some additional applications like synthetic jet fuel and ammonia for shipping. And these markets include those that are already established and emerging, like distributed power, which already has a pretty substantial market, forklifts and material handling, which has a substantial market, trucks and light duty passenger vehicles, which are being used throughout the country already on hydrogen. And you can see those markets are expected to grow pretty substantially. That's why the light blue is so much larger than the dark blue. And then the existing feedstock also will have a slight increase in its market. But then it must expand into these other decarbonization markets, like using it in steel production or in aviation or high-grade heat for industry. And finally, to also be used in medium and low-grade industrial heat and centralized power applications. And the roadmap describes these 4 phases, as I initially introduced them, as to taking some immediate first steps in existing applications like materials handling and in distributed power like the fuel cell systems that we are already using throughout society, and increasing those markets like applying them to data centers, for example. And then to scale that up so that we have more fueling stations, more automobiles, and then to diversify it so that we have not only light duty vehicles, but we also have heavy duty and medium duty vehicles and fleets and these kinds of things. These are already under development, but need to be diversified in the early years. And we already have also pilots for the next phase, blending of hydrogen, for example, for heating into the natural gas system. Or for the broad rollout, we already have research and development underway. And that research and development is for things like using hydrogen in aviation and using hydrogen in shipping and in steel and in all of these other applications. And the participating companies have put a lot of detail in each of these steps. I'm going to show just a couple of examples here. Fuel cell electric vehicle sales, they already are occurring at about 2,500 per year now. However, by 2050, by 2030, they must already be selling 1.2 million of these fuel cell electric vehicles, okay, to meet the goals of this roadmap. And fueling stations, similarly, we have less than 100 right now installed in the United States, but we have to have at least 4,300 of these, okay, by the time we have this broad rollout. And this will be an amazingly good contribution to the economy, with about 8 billion in sales in this broad rollout phase and over 500,000 new jobs in 2030. And not only would we have this economic boost, but it will lead to reductions, dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases and criteria pollutant emissions. By 2050, there will be a 16% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and a 36% reduction in nitrogen oxides just from this hydrogen use. This can't happen, though, without some actions. And that's what this roadmap sets forth. First of all, setting dependable, technology-neutral decarbonization goals. And then doing key things like creating incentives, supporting the infrastructure as it's being developed, including hydrogen-based options in government contracts, and expanding the use of hydrogen to other sectors. And then making systematic changes like research and development in new applications, harmonizing codes and standards, which is underway, supporting outreach and workforce development, and also energy sector regulations to account for new hydrogen uses. If you haven't yet seen the roadmap, it's available here at this ushydrogenstudy.org. I encourage you to look it up and find yourself reading the entirety of it. So now I want to open it up for questions, either for me or for the panel.
If you have any questions, please submit them through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar sidebar. To kick things off, one question we have for Jack is, what do you mean as unique features as a zero emissions vector?
So hydrogen can be made with zero emissions and can be converted back to water with zero emissions in electrolyzers and fuel cells and from renewable gases. So it's zero emissions is associated with how you make it and convert it. In addition, it can make massive energy storage because it has separate power and energy scaling characteristics, which is different from batteries when you're talking about energy storage. It also is the lightest element we know, so it can be used as a transportation fuel where batteries, because they are heavy, couldn't be used, like in long duration, heavy duty applications and things like this. It also can introduce resiliency in the grid by delivering that zero emissions energy as both a fuel and as electricity. These are just some of the unique features that hydrogen has to enable it to be used so broadly as we showed in those 5 uses case.
Thank you, Jack. Another question we just received is, you mentioned electrolysis. When can we expect to see large-scale production of hydrogen by this method?
So major announcements have already been made in Australia, in Germany, in France, in northern UK, for and in Saudi Arabia, if you can believe it, for very large solar and wind farms actually using electrolysis for making renewable hydrogen, zero emissions hydrogen. So it's already beginning today.
Great. Another question we have is, what is the outlook for articulation of direct policy regulatory support in terms of process efforts and timeline? Perhaps this would be a question for other members of the panel.
Yeah, anyone on the panel want to take that?
I'll give it a shot, Jack, and then I'll let others join in. So, you know, if you look at the present plan of the Biden green policies, hydrogen's well supported. And even acts that have gone through the House of Representatives have supported hydrogen. There's activity going on to increase the ITC to 30%, which provides an investment tax credit for fuel cells. There's activities going on to support, on a tax basis, hydrogen fueling stations, as well as hydrogen production like electrolyzers you mentioned. I would like to add, though, that hydrogen often has been a nonpartisan issue, which is unusual in the world. But the present investment tax credit actually was supported by just as many Republicans as Democrats. So I think us as an industry will work with whatever party's in place to support an industry which can create so many jobs for Americans.
Thank you very much, Andy. Andy Marsh, CEO of Plug Power. Let me mention a couple of additional items just from a California perspective, if you don't mind, because there are many policies currently in place in California associated with AB 32, SB 100, AB 8. Okay, these are all policies that are in place that are actually supporting the addition of more and more renewables in all applications first, and then secondly, the introduction of infrastructure for creating the hydrogen fueling infrastructure that we need for our automobiles, okay? And these are going in as we speak, okay? We already have a plan for more than 200 fueling stations just in California, which would be a very substantial, it would very substantially facilitate the fuel cell market in California.
Great. One more question is, how do you see the synergy between light and heavy duty vehicles?
So hydrogen has a very obvious advantage in heavy duty because it's so much lighter than batteries. And so you can still expect with hydrogen heavy duty applications to still carry all the payload that you carried before. You also have the advantage of going longer distances because of that light weight. So it has a very obvious advantage as a zero emissions fuel for heavy duty. But it also, I think, must be used in light duty applications as well for many reasons. One is that some vehicles need to refuel fast, and hydrogen can do that, whereas batteries can't. Some vehicles need a bigger payload, let's say like a contractor that has to carry a lot of things along. And some things need to go longer distances. Okay, so some applications need to go longer distances, rapid fueling, long range, heavy payload. All of those would be benefited by hydrogen as the zero emissions fuel. I think also the infrastructure associated with charging vehicles will be more expensive as we get to higher and higher penetration of zero emission vehicles. So hydrogen will have some infrastructure advantages too, I think. So both light duty and heavy duty will have both battery electric options and hydrogen options from my perspective. Jackie, do you want to add anything from Toyota?
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to chime in here. Yeah, from our perspective, we're building a lot of light duty vehicles. If you look at numbers, right, there's a lot more light duty vehicles on the road than there are heavy duty. So from Toyota's perspective, we see the light duty as the market opportunity to increase the amount of fuel cell stacks that we're building to a point where we see that amount of production really drive down the cost of the fuel cell stacks themselves. Whereas with the heavy duty, we're carrying about 10 times the amount of hydrogen on board that we do versus a light duty vehicle. So that's where we see the economies of scale start to factor in with how much hydrogen is being used in the heavy duty space. So really it's a great synergistic buildup where, you know, we need the light duty vehicles for the scale of the fuel cell stacks themselves, but the heavy duty vehicles for the scale of the hydrogen itself. And actually this question kind of plays back to the previous question about regulation, where we're starting to see the work that was done in the light duty space, for example, on the global technical regulation, which is for the hydrogen system itself, is being now adopted for heavy duty as well. So we're starting to see a lot of great global work that includes the Department of Transportation, as well as, you know, all the European regulatory companies and all of the Japanese companies are all working together to create this global regulation for both light duty and heavy duty compressed hydrogen storage systems.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for your initial questions here. Now I'd like to turn things over to our industry panel, and they will expand upon what the roadmap has presented. Our panelists today are Andy Marsh, CEO of Plug Power, Jackie Birdsall, Senior Engineer at Toyota North America, Wayne Leighty, at the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Business Development Manager at Shell, Karine Boissy-Rousseau, President of Hydrogen Energy and Mobility at Liquide North America, Mark Monroe, Data Center Advanced Development at Microsoft, and Yuri Freedman, Senior Director of Business Development at Southern California Gas Company. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Andy Marsh, CEO of Plug Power. Andy.
Well, thank you, Jack. I'm Andy Marsh, the CEO of Plug Power. And Connor, if you could go to the next slide. And my first message, everyone, is the fuel cell market is today. And Plug Power puts fuel cells into forklift trucks. And you think, wow, that's not all that important. Well, 25% of the retail food in the US during the COVID crisis actually moved through Plug Power's products. And why are Plug Power's products used in this application? Very much like the issues that Jack brought up about why fuel cells make sense. Fast fueling versus battery and long range, what it actually means in the distribution center is that you move goods faster. And we're doing this for household names, people everyone knows, Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot, and even the manufacturing sector, folks like BMW. And when you look at Plug Power, the numbers are, we've deployed over 40,000 fuel cells, mostly in North America. We do about 27,000 fuelings a day, and we use over 28 million tons of hydrogen a day. For over 28 million tons of hydrogen, I'm getting my numbers mixed up. We do 27,000 fuelings. We use about 27 tons of hydrogen a day, which is like 54,000 gallons of gasoline, just to give you a sense of the scale. And Connor, if you move to the next slide, we've also built over 100 hydrogen stations for people like Walmart and Amazon that span the US. And these are commercial applications, different than the retail stations Jack highlighted. But if you work at Walmart, you could actually start in Lewiston, Maine in a truck and actually drive all the way to California, and there'd be hydrogen all the way there. And Plug Power, has really focused on not only being a technology leader in providing fuel cells for multiple applications, but have a big focus on green hydrogen, which we're not going to just do ourselves. But as we announced at our Plug Power Symposium last week, we plan to build 5 green hydrogen stations across North America, using 100 tons of hydrogen a day. And as Jack says, the source for that will be renewables, solar, wind, hydroelectric power. And we announced deals with Apex, a major wind provider in the Midwest, as well as Brookfield, a company that has over $500 billion under asset management. Much of that is in renewables. We'll also work with other partners along the way. We're not doing this ourselves, and we're welcome to partner with anyone interested in building out the green hydrogen network. But we take steps to make sure we have the capabilities in doing that. We bought a company called United Hydrogen, which was the first company to build a private liquid hydrogen plant in North America. We also, and Jack touched on electrolyzers, we also bought a company that had 47 years of PEM electrolyzer experience in Massachusetts, that have been involved in putting electrolyzers in space with NASA for undersea operations. That's Giner EOX, and now Plug Power electrolyzers. And if you move on to the next slide, Connor, it's not only that. Plug Power is building in North America one of the world's first PEM technology gigafactory. So if you were looking at a fuel cell, the key element is the fuel cell stack, and that's made up of MEAs as well as bipolar plates. And this factory will have the ability to build 60,000 fuel cell stacks. It'll be able to have an output of 1.5 gigawatts of stacks. That'll be made with Plug Power MEAs, where we'll be able to process over 7 million MEAs, as well as stamping out 7 million bipolar plants a year, and support 500 megawatts of electrolyzer output. Pretty impressive factory, and it'll start being online in July of 2021. As I mentioned before, Plug Power believes the world is now. We have activities going on ports in both North America and Europe. We cut a deal with Goosan to put drayage ports and drayage products at our customer sites for trucks, as well as at ports. We'll have on-the-road vehicles for Class 6 trucks, as well as Class 8 vehicles. We announced we'll be putting some Class 8 vehicles on the road with Leighty just last week. And finally, I know Mark's going to talk about Plug Power made an announcement to do large-scale backup power systems that in offering that we put out for data centers, for microgrid, as well as for distribution centers. So many of the same customers who use our forklift truck products will actually use these logistic products that I outlined here. And so going to the next slide, Connor, I just want to mention that, as Jack mentioned, this business and industry is beginning to build now. We'll do in 2024, we're well on the path of $1.2 billion in annual sales. And I'd like to highlight to people, when you just look at the forklift truck industry, when you look at our third quarter output, we're already 60% there. So it's not a huge goal for these other steps. And we're looking at OI for $200 million. But as the roadmap highlights, it just doesn't stop in 2024. Plug Power is already a technology leader here in the fuel cell industry, both with our fuel cells and electrolyzers. And we plan to be, again with partners, a leader in green hydrogen. So Jack, thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you very much, Andy. And next we have Jackie Birdsall, the senior engineer at Toyota North America. Jackie?
Thank you, Jack. So I just a few slides here to explain what we see as our part, Toyota's part, in this overall roadmap that Jack has presented. So for Toyota, we've been working on fuel cell electric vehicles for over 25 years. And back in 2015, we launched our first production version of all of those years of development, which was called the Toyota Mirai, which actually in Japanese means future, because that really demonstrated what we thought to be the future of our vehicle lineup. So this part of what we call Environmental Challenge 2050, which is our own internal plan to get to a reduction in overall CO2 emissions associated with our fleet from a well-to-wheel standpoint by 90% by 2050 compared to our 2010 levels. So really the only way to get there is through electrification. And from our perspective, that comes as a mixture of battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles. And we'll see that when we allow customers to make a decision of what best suits their lifestyle, that's what really will be the key to kicking off a zero-emission vehicle change in the transportation sector. And so the reason why the Mirai is so important as one of our two zero-emission vehicle options is that it refills in less than 5 minutes, and the previous generation went 312 miles on a refill. So you can have vehicles after vehicles filling every 5 minutes and driving off with another 300 miles of all-electric range. So it's really an important piece of our portfolio. So then in 2017, what we did was we took two Mirai fuel cell stacks and we put them into a Class 8 semi, which we call Project Portal. And we already have two of these semis running around the ports doing what's called drayage, which means that they take the cargo from the marine vessels up the 710 freeway here in Los Angeles to the rail yards, where they are then distributed around the US. And why this is so important is there's 16,000 diesel semis that do this every day in the port. And you can then imagine the impact to the local air quality. These communities that live around the ports, they have higher rates of asthma, higher rates of cancer even. And it's really not something that needs to happen. I mean, we can move these all to zero emission vehicles. We can move these all to fuel cell electric trucks. So that's what we're demonstrating now at the port. We already have these trucks running. We're building 3 more heavy duty hydrogen stations to fill these trucks. And we're building 10 more trucks that are going to be taking over the roles of these diesel semis that are currently operating in the port. So Connor, can you go to the next slide, please? So then last year, we announced the 2021 Mirai, which is our second generation fuel cell vehicle. And the exciting part, well, actually there's several exciting parts about this new vehicle, but one is that we've moved it to a rear wheel drive platform. So it's a totally different driving experience. It's one where we really think we're going to invite a lot of new customers into this space because the vehicle is not only incredibly attractive, but also really fun to drive. So we think that there's going to be a lot of new customers coming in, a lot of new requests for light duty vehicles, and subsequently for the hydrogen stations to be placed to support the rollout of this fleet. The other part is that we increased the production capacity at our factory by 10-fold. So we're going to be making a lot more fuel cell stacks. And what that does is that opens the door to all types of new opportunities. So Connor, can you go to the next slide, please? And here's just a few glimpses into some of the applications where we've taken the hydrogen fuel cell stacks that we're now building. We've put one into what's called the Energy Observer, which is the boat that's traveling around the world currently and is actually making its own hydrogen on board. Also, as I mentioned, we already have 2 trucks in operation around the port, but we've built more trucks that are getting ready and going through the research and development at our facilities. Below that, you see a picture of what's called a utility tractor rig. This is another piece of cargo handling equipment that operates around the port. Previously, always powered by diesel. Now we're moving that to fuel cells well. So this is one that we call the Uno that we've been running around the ports of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach. Also, sorry, Andy, I guess for competitor here, but we put a fuel cell into a forklift. And this forklift is currently operating at our Motomachi plant, which is where we build the Toyota Mirai. So now we have fuel cells building fuel cells. And then finally, we've also put fuel cell stacks into stationary applications. For example, here we see a stationary application at the Motomachi plant where we use some of our excess hydrogen to create stationary power on site. So really, the opportunities are endless. Pretty much anything that we currently power by diesel or gasoline, we can replace with hydrogen and fuel cell electric power and move away from these harmful emissions and drive towards our goal of CO2 reduction. That's it for me. Jack, I'll kick it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Next, we have Wayne Leighty, Hydrogen Fuel Cell Business Development Manager at Shell. Wayne?
Yes, hi, Jack. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm Wayne Leighty. I'm the Shell Hydrogen Business Development Manager for North America. The next slide asks you to please not make any investment decisions based on my comments today. On the next slide, at Shell, in our new energies business, we're investing in the full range of new fuels. And what that means is we take a rather objective view on hydrogen. We understand its relative positioning, the advantages and the challenges. And so I work to deliver the kind of progress that's needed to really open the opportunities that are identified in this roadmap we're talking about today. On the next slide, you can see our hydrogen business is growing globally. In Europe, we're a member of the H2 Mobility joint venture in Germany, progressing toward as many as 400 hydrogen refueling stations. On the left side in California now, we have 9 hydrogen stations plus 3 in development for the Class 8 drayage trucks out of the ports of LA and Long Beach. And we're now starting a program of building 48 more. With let's see, we also have some moderate scale, what we would think of as moderate scale electrolysis in construction now in Germany at the 10 megawatt scale, and we have some large scale gigawatt scale in planning. And on the right hand side, you can see we're in a consortium now in sea trials with the first liquid hydrogen ship. On the next slide, we're doing this by delivering and in order to deliver a tremendous pace of progress. Our next hydrogen refueling stations that you see here double the performance while having the cost of the last stations. Some of you may have watched Tesla Battery Day. In effect, at Shell for hydrogen fueling, we've done a similar thing as Battery Day twice, and we have the next combination ready to do it again. On the next slide, we are in construction and nearing commissioning now of those 3 hydrogen refueling stations to serve heavy-duty drayage trucks for the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. That's in collaboration with other companies, including Toyota, who you just heard from. And on the next slide, as I mentioned, we're in construction now of a 10 megawatt electrolyzer in Germany. And on the last slide, we've announced plans for coupling electrolysis with large offshore wind in the Netherlands at the gigawatt scale. I wanted to close by just picking up on a comment and a question made earlier around the role of hydrogen fuel cells in mobility, and indeed the answers were quite good, expanding our thinking from vehicle classes to use cases. I would add to that by thinking market segments and customer segments. Really, we start to see that hydrogen fuel cells and battery electric vehicles are quite complementary in providing customers the kind of options needed for widespread adoption, in the capability and the freedom to move for high mileage drivers, for drivers who may live in multi-unit dwellings or otherwise not have good access to charging. And so at the end of the day, in our view, it's time to move past the question of a competitive mindset, which will win kind of narrative, and embrace that both are quite complementary and do best with each other. And also Jack's comments from an energy system perspective, hydrogen increases the penetration of renewable energy production, brilliant and affordable. Thank you.
Absolutely, Wayne. Way to go. So thank you very much. Next, we have Karine Boissy-Rousseau, President of Hydrogen Energy and Mobility at Air Liquide North America. Karine?
Thank you very much, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here today for the launch of the US roadmap for hydrogen economy, and thank you for inviting me. So my name is Karine Boissy-Rousseau. I'm the president of Air Liquide Hydrogen Energy and Mobility here in the US. And I'm here to share with you some of what we in Air Liquide are doing to make this roadmap happen. So if we go on the next slide to present Air Liquide, our business is actually to produce and distribute industrial gases. And by that, we mean molecules like oxygen, nitrogen, argon, but also CO2 and hydrogen. Air Liquide is a global company. We're present in 80 countries in all geographies, and we supply over 1 million customers with the support of our 67,000 employees. We do supply already a lot of industries ranging from refining, petrochemicals, but also the food industry, pharmaceuticals, as well as others like research. Now, if we go on the next slide, in fact, Air Liquide already produces today a large amount of hydrogen, over 14 billion cubic meters per year. This would be equivalent to supplying over 10 million fuel cell vehicles. So Air Liquide has developed actually over the past 50 years expertise in that activity already. Today, most of that hydrogen is used for the refining industry and the petrochemical industry, like Jack was describing earlier. But with these 50 years of experience, Air Liquide has developed expertise in the different steps of that supply chain, starting from production with different types of technologies, steam reforming, electrolysis, gasification, but also distribution of hydrogen. So either via pipeline or by trailers. And Air Liquide is also developing technology that allows the use of this hydrogen in different markets. And like, for example, here in the mobility market, we're developing technologies on filling stations. So now if we go to the next slide, in Air Liquide, we actually believe that hydrogen has a very strong role to play in the hydrogen economy and in reaching global objectives on climate. Air Liquide is actually a founding member of the Hydrogen Council. We have also announced our own climate objective, and we are working on our own internal processes to be able to reduce our carbon intensity by 30% in 2025. But most importantly, we truly develop and want to support actively the development of this hydrogen roadmap towards a hydrogen economy. And if we go now to the next slide, what we find very interesting is that what we see on this roadmap and what we see going on in the market and where people are acting, we see that we've reached an important milestone in this roadmap. So basically what we see is that hydrogen is now scaling up and specifically transitioning to real projects. So it's not a roadmap anymore. Things are really happening and being built in the ground. And in Air Liquide, what we're doing is investments to ensure that we do our part in making this happen. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you what we're doing there. So as of today, we're actually building and constructing a brand new production capacity for hydrogen to supply the West Coast and the California mobility market. So that plant is actually being built in Nevada, near Las Vegas. It's an investment of over $150 million, and it will produce over 30 tons per day of liquid hydrogen that will be shipped to the West Coast. With that plant itself, we can already supply over 40,000 fuel cell vehicles. But it's not only this technology that we're investing in, we're also investing in renewable electrolyzer technology. And the second large investment that we're doing in North America is actually building the largest membrane electrolyzer in the world today. It's a 20 megawatt electrolyzer that we're building in Bécancour in Canada to supply both the northeast of the US and the Quebec area in Canada. So this electrolyzer actually is supplied by renewable hydropower and will thus be able to produce green hydrogen. If we go to the next slide, I'm going actually to show you what we're doing here. Like said earlier and like described in the roadmap, we want to be technology agnostic to produce hydrogen and make sure that we can all jointly deliver on this hydrogen economy. Renewable electrolysis, water electrolysis is one of the key technologies that will make up the future. We in Air Liquide already operate 40 electrolyzers in our current portfolio. We've started to invest and produce smaller sizes of electrolysis. We started like 10 years ago, but we're moving ahead with a 20 megawatt today and have plans already for the next generation of 100 megawatts. What we think is that this technology is not an idea anymore. The challenge that we are working on right now is really bringing that to a very large scale, which means working on the industrialization of the technology, both in terms of operation, maintenance, and size. The challenge here is for all of us as an industry to be able to reduce the total cost of ownership and make sure that we can bring this renewable hydrogen to all users in the market. Last but not least, if we go to the last slide, Connor, thanks. We in Air Liquide are also investing to support the growth of that market and support companies that really help build this. And we've invested in First Element Fuel, who is today the largest retailer of hydrogen as a clean fuel in California, and are also investing in hydrogenics on this electrolysis technology. With that being said, I hand it over to you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Karine. Next, we have Mark Monroe, Data Center Advanced Development at Microsoft. Mark?
Thanks, Jack. I want to spend a minute going over what hyperscale companies are, because we're kind of the only end user in this panel. There's folks that are making fuel cells and folks that are making hydrogen. Microsoft has been experimenting with hydrogen as a way to supplement some of our power needs. But I want to give you a feeling for what that means on a scale. So let's go to the next slide. We use the term hyperscale. There are about 24 companies, Microsoft included, and you can probably think of the names of a number of other ones that think in this kind of a scale. And to give you an idea of what we mean by that, this is a picture of our chairman, our CEO rather, Satya Nadella, at a conference in November last year. And let's go to the next slide real quick. He was talking about how much storage will be needed just to cover the needs of the cloud that's in the digital infrastructure world. And he said we're going to go to 175 zettabytes of data by 2025. That's only 5 years from now, up from 40 zettabytes. Now, if you don't know what a zettabyte is, there's a little indicator on the chart to the right. A zettabyte is 1 million petabytes, 1 billion terabytes a gazillion megabytes. So it's a very large number of amount of storage. And the device that's pictured there is a single rack product that's offered by one of the companies in the industry that is about 1 petabyte. Now, it turns out that we will need 135 million of those devices to cover what Satya says is going to happen in the next 5 years. So if you go to the next slide, I laid this out. It's going to take 105 square miles of space and 2 gigawatts of electricity to cover that need just for storage in the cloud. So the amount of digital infrastructure that's required is growing very rapidly and very large. Let's go to the next slide. And this will show you a little bit. You can go to the next one after that. Those are 2 nuclear plants that we'll need to cover the 2 gigawatts of power that the storage will cover over there. But we can go to the next slide. That's fine, Connor. This is a satellite photograph of a town in Virginia. Boynton, Virginia is where Microsoft has one of its East Coast data centers. And again, just to give you scale, the yellow arrow points at the town of Boynton. The darker yellow outlines are the land that Microsoft has purchased to build data centers on in that one location only. And let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of one of our installations actually in Eastern Washington. This picture was taken in July of 2018. And just to give you a feel of how rapidly this grows, those buildings that are there, the groups of 4, each are about 30 megawatts of power consumption. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that less than 2 years later, the yellow arrows are pointing to the 2 buildings that we were looking at in July of 2018. And now we've built 4 more buildings that have more capacity than the 2 that were there already. And there's more being constructed on this site even as we speak. So the industry is expanding very rapidly and has very specific needs in terms of the power availability. So let's go to the next slide. Diesel generators are a very important part today of the power infrastructure. We have to provide what we call 5 nines of availability, so 99.999% of availability on electrical power within those data centers. And Microsoft and every other hyperscale company and everyone who has a data center, in fact, uses diesel generators today to complete that electrical infrastructure. But if we go to the next slide, we've looked into what it might take to replace diesel generators with an equivalent amount of power generated by hydrogen fuel cells. And you may have seen some of the articles of the testing that we've done, where we've been testing fuel cells up to 48 hours in scale that's about 1/4 of a megawatt. Our next goal is to take it up so that we could replace one of our 3 megawatt generators, which is represented graphically on the left side of the screen, with a complex that might be roughly the same amount of power in a fuel cell type of installation. And you can see that the storage tanks are different. The diesel has a tank underneath it that stores up to 48 hours worth of fuel. We've made some of the same considerations using liquid hydrogen in this example, but we've been experimenting with a number of different things. But to give you an idea of the scale of these, if you think back to those buildings, we don't go back to that slide, but think back to those buildings that are 30 megawatts of power each. If we go to the next slide, what we'll have to do is probably centralize the storage. 30 megawatts of power to be able to run for 48 hours is going to require a sphere of liquid hydrogen, something like this. A megawatt of IT equipment would go through one of the liquid hydrogen trucks that's in the foreground every 24 hours, about 2 tons of hydrogen per megawatt of IT equipment. And so for 48 hours, that's 100 tons of hydrogen that we would have to have on storage ready to go in case of an emergency. And having liquid hydrogen, it just doesn't sit around. Of course, it boils off and becomes gaseous. So we think that we probably need to integrate our hydrogen infrastructure with the rest of a global hydrogen economy. So let's go to the last slide. This is kind of our vision. Of course, we're data center people, so we have a data center centric view. But we think that hydrogen storage at data centers could interact with the electric grid. It could serve for vehicle or material handling, fueling, and refueling. We think we could pair fuel cells with electrolyzers and provide grid interactive services for balancing renewable energy as it comes onto the grid, and potentially even produce hydrogen from excess energy and distribute it into natural gas lines that might be nearby. Ultimately, we'd love to be able to have hydrogen pipelines that might be able to supply us for areas where the electric grid is constrained, and be able to make our own clean power out of clean hydrogen gas. So Jack, I'll turn it back to you with that.
Thank you very much, Mark. And finally, we have Yuri Freedman, Senior Director of Business Development at SoCalGas. Yuri?
Thank you very much, Jack, and pleasure to be here. I will try to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, so I'll try to go fast. Let's go to the next slide, please. Hydrogen is one of the strategic priorities of our company, and without belaboring the point, the largest gas utility in North America that serves about 22 million customers. We have about 100,000 miles of pipe, large footprint, large customer base, obviously large capabilities to deploy infrastructure scale, and we are looking and working on bringing these capabilities to help adoption of hydrogen in California. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a really important slide, which I think unifies a lot of what you have heard from the previous panelists. I would direct your attention to the right-hand side of that slide. And quite simply, it shows that clean molecules and clean electrons are not competing with each other, as previous panelists indicated. They're highly complementary, and it takes their combination to reach scenarios of global decarbonization. In fact, the split between molecules and electrons is about half and half in 2050. So I think this has profound implications for policymakers, for all the stakeholders, because it is not about which one is going. It's about the need for these two, for more molecules and electrons, to work together to cover a broad range of end-use applications to make sure that we decarbonize across the sectors. With that, let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about California. And maybe instead of going through all the bullet points, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's go to the next slide. And I think the chart on the next slide illustrates vividly why hydrogen is ripe for adoption in California. What you see on the left-hand side is the curtailments of renewable power. And there are two observations you can make. One is that they're rapidly growing, and the more renewables will be built, the more of those curtailments will occur. The second and really important fact is that these curtailments are highly seasonal. If you look carefully at those waves, you see that curtailments peak in so-called shoulder months, when supply of energy exceeds demand, and then the curtailments drop rapidly in the peak months, such as, let's say, August and September in California, where it's hot and demand for energy is high. So from here, you can draw immediate conclusion about the massive need to store large amounts of energy for long periods of time. And let's go to the next slide. And the batteries have an important role to play in the power market, but as you can see from looking at the vertical axis, the duration capacity of batteries is relatively limited. They operate in hours. As you saw in the previous chart, we are talking about months. And the next slide is going to illustrate that if you're talking about storing large amounts of energy for long periods of time, hydrogen really has very few equals. It is the method of choice to accomplish that task. Next slide, please. The important element of what a lot of my panelists mentioned is the need to reduce cost of production. What I find remarkable is that if we go to the next slide, we observe that California, of all places, have proved that technology with policy support can remarkably rapidly drop costs. This is the price of renewable power in California. And you can see that the price of renewables went down by a full order of magnitude in a space of just 1 decade. That's what I think underpins confidence of industry participants in the potential of hydrogen to scale up, to rapidly reduce costs, and to become a really important element of the Californians, North Americans, and the global energy mix. Let's go to the next slide. And the one last point I'll make is that this scale up would require infrastructure, and I think you've seen this in multiple presentations of my fellow panelists. We're actively working to bring our assets, our capabilities, our competencies in California to help scale up adoption of hydrogen, because experience suggests that repurposing and retooling existing assets is often more cost-effective and more feasible option than developing new ones from scratch. With that, I'll close off my presentation, hand it back over to Jack.
Thank you very much, Yuri, and thank you to all of you panelists for terrific presentations. Thank you so much. We will try to hold it open for a few more minutes of questions and answers. Do we have any questions, Connor?
Yes, lots of questions. For anyone else that has any questions, please again submit them through the questions tab. For a number of panelists, a question was brought up about the fuel cell and hydrogen industry's view towards the battery sector. Is there any, Jack, would you like to take that one or pass it off to anybody?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
The questions were related to, do you see battery-powered EVs as a challenge to hydrogen vehicles, or basically the few questions
Absolutely not, and you heard it from many panelists here. Many panelists here identified the fact that there's different use cases for these, and if you and batteries are also always present even on fuel cell vehicles, so they work together from my perspective. And I think that you're going to see various use cases that are going to prefer batteries and other use cases that are going to prefer hydrogen. These are complementary and both necessary solutions for our zero emissions future. That's what Yuri just said too. Hey, half of our decarbonization's got to come from zero emissions gas, zero emissions molecules. The other half comes from electrification, okay, of various things with renewable electricity.
Hey, Jack, I would also add in, and I think it's brought up in the roadmap, the industrial sector where high heat's required, the carbon footprint's just as big as transportation. And that's really why hydrogen's required for a decarbonized world, among other reasons. But I mean, I think that's a perfect example where batteries
there are some things, absolutely, Andy, that you cannot electrify. You cannot make batteries light enough to do these things. And so hydrogen fits into some applications where no other known zero emissions solution exists. You can't make cement, you can't make steel, you can't make ammonia, you can't do chip manufacturing that requires a reducing gas. You have all these things that you need hydrogen for that can't be done by electrification.
And this, not to belabor the point, but just to build on what Jack said, there's oftentimes perception of those hard to electrify sectors as small and niche. So a couple of numbers. In California, we think about transportation as by far the biggest component of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and they are. Transportation in California accounts for about 40% of total GHG emissions. Well, if you look at the world, transportation is only 15% of global emissions. So those sectors that Andy just mentioned are not niche, they are large, and it's essential for us to find ways to decarbonize them if we're going to be successful in applying these solutions globally. That's where green gases, including hydrogen, are going to play a very important role.
Absolutely, and some are associated also with our food supply, like our ammonia production. So lots of sectors that require this.
Great. Another question is, what do you think is more critical to the United States' ability to catch up and keep up with green hydrogen focus of other regions like Asia or Europe, private investment or government support?
I'd like to ask Karine to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Indeed, what we see is a lot of activity going on in different geographies, in Asia, but also in Europe, where governments have actually announced very large funding plans for a hydrogen economy. And we can quote, Germany putting 9 billion euro on the table, France 7 billion, Europe itself has a hydrogen plan as well, but we can also talk about Portugal and other geographies. So there are some massive investments that are being made, and part of that will be public, but also there will be private investments along with that. And somehow the situation we're in today is indeed a little bit the chicken and egg situation, where at the same time, you need to develop the infrastructure and the usage for hydrogen. And for that to happen and to incentivize also industry and private investment, it requires a set of legislation that really support and help, at least kicking off the business and the activity. And that will be the first step in order to trigger the scale effect, the manufacturing capacity, as well as the increase in customer demand and usage for hydrogen. And it will put us on a virtuous circle of cost decrease, which by itself will open up new markets like Jack described earlier with heating and power generation and everything. So yes, I think we are at the early steps of a very fascinating time for hydrogen.
Absolutely, thank you. We have another question?
This one is for Andy. Are you also offering stacks for the aviation sector? There seems to be strong interest in picking up for fuel cell power aviation recently.
It must be one of my employees who were asking that question. So the answer is yes. We announced a deal last week with a company called Universal Hydrogen, which is actually using the same stacks which would be used in large-scale backup power, as well as on-road vehicles. So we expect to be flying in 2024 regional aircrafts, which will be converted from internal, from being propeller prop planes to fuel cell power planes, with demonstrations in 2023. So yes, there is a lot of excitement. I think that's another space where 2.5% of the GHGs are associated with aircraft, and there aren't that many solutions to be able to reduce their carbon footprint.
Very nice. We'll be answering questions for another 5 minutes, okay? So hopefully that'll give you some time to get your questions in. Next question, Connor?
Yes, going forward, as the energy sector weighs its options for achieving emissions reductions in line with governmental climate plans, is hydrogen power better positioned than other renewable fuels such as ethanol or biodiesel as a long-term solution for climate change? As well as how many years will it take to scale up access to hydrogen at a level comparable to those other fuels? So I think that this one is directed to Wayne and others.
Wayne? Let me just mention, as Wayne gets his audio back up, that biofuels are very important for us to use and to develop and to manage, because forever we will have these waste streams with us and we must use those fuels. They are not as widely available, nor will they be able to make as much of this renewable zero emissions hydrogen as we can by electrolysis and nuclear and other clean electrical ways of making that hydrogen. So the majority of it will come from electrolytic hydrogen sources. Maybe that's enough to answer that question. But both are important, right? Because we're always going to have to manage those waste streams and use that too in our sustainable economy.
Great. Another question is, how is the industry working together? Are any of you working together in partnerships or collaboration currently?
I would just add, I buy from Karine here, her liquid hydrogen. So, and we certainly, many of us work on government policies, and we hope to sell fuel cells to many, many people, both people who can be competitors as well as partners, so we all do work together.
Yeah, I think in several of the slides that you saw, you know, there was photos of either our trucks or, you know, Karine's dispenser or Wayne's dispenser. So especially between, you know, infrastructure providers and Toyota, we have a very strong relationship. But, you know, the industry as a whole, any advancements that we make on any front is really a step in the right direction. So we all do work together on, you know, harmonization of codes and standards, on putting dispensers where they need to be placed, but also in advancements of components themselves. You know, so there's a lot of collaboration in this space. It's actually one of the reasons why I've always loved working in the hydrogen industry is the amount of collaboration that takes place among the companies.
And maybe I would like to second my fellow panelists and also say that from what we see, this collaboration takes place in two forms. One is the collaboration across the value chain, because if you think about this commodity, all the elements of it have to fall in place: production, distribution, transportation, storage, and the end use. It all has to work together, from production of molecules to their consumption in power plants, in vehicles, in stationary sources. So think about how closely participants need to work for that to happen. But the second element, what I find is extremely important, is the global collaboration. And we are involved in multiple collaborations across the world. We find that many times this is highly beneficial to both parties, because ultimately all gas utilities in the world are looking at the ways in which we can contribute to adoption of hydrogen. And we are talking to Asian, Australian, European utilities. There's a remarkably fruitful dialogue that I observe, and I think it's going to help drive the adoption fast enough to meet the climate goals.
Jack, I also should mention the obvious. We collaborated on this report together with McKinsey.
Yes, the obvious. Yeah, that's very good, Andy. One final question, please.
All right, one last question. How soon do you see hydrogen becoming competitive with natural gas in transportation and power generation?
So we've done a study for California that suggests that as we start to introduce some of these major projects, like those that we heard many of the companies talk about today, the cost of hydrogen will come down that curve very rapidly, like the cost that Yuri showed for the solar and wind in California. So that we think that within the decade, it's going to start becoming cost competitive with what we currently do today with fossil fuels. I don't know if that's about the same as most of the other companies, but this was our independent analysis at UCI that suggested in a decade, it's going to start to become cost competitive with our fossil fuels that we use today.
Jack, this is, I think that the Hydrogen Council has a similar view. If you look at their latest report that came out in January, they're looking at things in 2030. And the other thing that I'll say is that cost may not be the only driver. Just last week, we heard from California Energy Commission in a communication to data centers specifically, that we need to look for solutions that can power a data center without an electric grid for up to 96 hours based on some of the things that they're seeing in the wildfire outages. And they, in the same communique, they've said, and it can't be diesel because of the air quality implications. So, you know, hydrogen may be the only choice in some cases.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you all again for your questions, for your great presentations. Thank you so much for your time that you spent here today. I want to remind everyone that you can get a copy of the roadmap for yourself at ushydrogenstudy.org. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.